Am I still? I was gonna be.
Yesterday, I woke up and did my class. Like, I don't have any. And then I was like, back to bed. I jumped in my bed and threw the.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Why don't we get started? Probably I'll just stall for a few minutes. I'm assuming there'll be one or two more people on their way in. But nice to see you all here. We're almost halfway through. And let's begin sort of where we did last week, where I said that I would start beginning with good news or happy stories or anything sort of positive to sort of take a little bit of the edge off the gloom that seems to be continually over our city for a variety of reasons. Anybody want to share anything? Let's get started here. So what has happened over the last week or so that you would like to share with us?
Got into Teachers College.
You got into Teachers College. Congratulations. Where are you going to be going?
Lakehead.
Possibly Lakehead. Excellent. Well, fantastic. Congratulations to you. That's really exciting news. Other stuff. Yeah.
Also to a master's program.
You got into a master's program. Congratulations to you. Well, I guess there isn't just doom and gloom this time of year. There's lots of good news too. Other stuff. Anybody else have some other things you want to share? There's got to be other stuff. That's it. I don't really have anything good to share. Yesterday was my birthday, by the way. I'm 56 now. So I'm on my way, slowly approaching old age, downhill, cognitive decline, professional decline. It's all on the way downhill. We don't have time to talk about that very much in this class. I might a little bit when we get to the expertise, but those of you that were in my class 2 years ago probably remember that I made a big point about how fluid intelligence, which is the kind of intelligence you need to solve problems and make good decisions, kind of peaks for you right now. You're at the peak of your cognitive powers. I am well past the peak of my cognitive powers. And that's no joke. It really does sort of, about the time you're in your mid-20s, everything starts to go downhill for creative thinking and complex tasks. So by the time I'm in my mid-50s, I should be preparing for, if not actual cognitive decline, at least professional decline. I'm not as good as at doing what I used to be. It's just a fact. As you get older, you have more encapsulated knowledge. You have more knowledge in general. You might consider that to be some form of wisdom or a lot of collected experience. So we do talk about that when we talk about experts. So I might be an expert in some things, but I get less flexible as I get older. So I'm embracing that and looking forward to becoming less flexible with age. Anyway, yes, yesterday I was 56, and as you know, the groundhog. Did the groundhog see? No, the groundhog did not see his shadow. So that means more spring is on the way. This is obviously based in nothing. And I don't know if you watched the little bit of the news of poor Wyerton Willie. He's an albino groundhog in Wyerton. And he didn't seem very happy. He seemed not at all happy. He was in a little plexiglass cube up on the stage, and I felt really bad for him. I think he just wanted to continue to sleep, which makes sense. Okay, so anything else that we want to share? We've got lots of good news, acceptances into Teachers College, graduate schools, birthdays, etc. Other good news, we've got our exam coming up. That's not really good news itself, but it could be considered a type of good news in the sense that it means Slack week is right after. So we're halfway through the term. So first of all, some general announcements. We've got a quiz. Quiz number 2 is available on Brightspace Owl at 12:30 today. Is it available now by any chance? So I got the timing right. So it should be available at 12:30. Same parameters as the quiz 2 weeks ago. It'll be open for 12 hours. You can take as long as you need to finish it. There's no time limit. It's straightforward. All the questions will be there. It's a random selection of questions, and just take what you need to finish. Actually, I just thought of something. I'm not 100% sure I took off the time limit. Yeah.
But if you close your computer.
Yeah. So if you close your computer and then it stops,
No time limit, but if you close your computer,
yeah,
you can't go back.
oh, you can't get back into it. So you got to complete it in one phase. All right, so helpful news. Let me see if I can adjust some of the parameters. I'll try to do this before I get back to my office. So it starts at 12:30. I'm going to try to finish up a little bit early today. Let me just check to make sure that everybody can go back in afterwards. If anybody had difficulty with that, sort of getting halfway through and then coming back, we'll work out details. I'll also make sure there's no time limit. There was a time limit on these quizzes last year. It was 20 minutes. And I think I've taken that off already, but it just occurred to me I didn't check it again right before I published it. So I'll do that before it starts. So we have a quiz. That quiz will be open for 12 hours. And as soon as you're finished, you'll get your mark. And then once it's all finished for everybody, you'll have the questions, answers, correct answers, et cetera, so that you can help to prepare. For your midterm, which is next week, there was a study guide. I'll talk a little bit about the kinds of questions at the end of today's class. So stick around to the end. It's a mix of multiple choice, short answer, and written work. It's about a little bit more than half multiple choice, but mostly it's half and half. There'll be some questions that are worth 1 point. So a multiple choice fill in the blank, that's a single point. A longer multi-part question might be worth up to 6 points. And I'll say a little bit about this at the end of class today, and you'll see why. But if it's a question that requires you to sort of say 3 or 4 things, it's going to be worth 3 or 4 points. It's going to be given here in class next Tuesday, right here. So 9:30 to 12:30. If you take your exam with accommodated services, presumably you've already made arrangements for that, and they have a copy of the same exam on file. So everything is set up for that. And then, of course, there won't be any class that following week because it'll be reading week or slack week or winter break, whatever you want to refer to it as. And then we'll return on February 24th, if I got my dates right. That's 2 weeks from now. 3 weeks from now. 1 week is the midterm, 2 weeks is break, 3 weeks will be our next lecture. So we got a lot of time off in between the end of today's lecture and the next lecture for new content. Any questions at all? If there's questions about the midterm, I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of today's class. So in the foggiest concept idea, a lot of people wanted to know a little bit more about linear separability, which is not surprising to me because, number one, it's a bit of a it is a little bit of a complex topic, I think, and it also dovetails with descriptions of prototype and exemplar models, which are themselves somewhat complex topics. And third, it's at the end of a long class. So it was the last topic I covered at the end of a 3-hour lecture. So I'm not surprising that maybe I sort of ran out of steam. Maybe I didn't explain it as clearly as I could have. So let me go through a slightly different example. One of the questions that came up, a few people wondered, like, what exactly is a non-linearly separable category? So I gave you a very structured version of that. And the idea was that if any group of objects can be summarized with an average, meaning that the average, the prototype, has things in common with all of the members, then it's probably a linearly separable category because alternative categories, everything clusters around their prototype. And prototypes do a good job of representing linearly separable categories and therefore classifying objects into linearly separable categories. But in real life, not everything is perfectly linearly separable. Sometimes you have exception items to your category or things that are unclear. And a prototype representation that summarizes everything and kind of sits at the middle, average and abstraction of a bunch of items, doesn't necessarily represent that kind of concept very well if there are outlier items. So this is actually what I just said. If a prototype is an abstracted average, that's how one way to define a prototype, it implies that all category members share most of their features with the prototype. That's what a prototype is. It's in the middle, and everything in that concept, you've abstracted the prototype from your experience, shares features with it. As a result, the prototype cannot reliably predict classification of category members that may not share many features with it, especially if they share a lot of features with some alternative category. For example, e-bikes, which may or may not be legal to ride on the sidewalks or the roads or the Thames Valley Parkway. Does anybody know for sure? Can you ride an e-bike like this on the TVP, the Thames Valley Parkway bike path? How many people know the answer to this, yes or no? Set aside the fact that people do. Is it technically allowed? I have no idea. I see a lot of them, but I have no idea if they're allowed. Furthermore, I have no idea what even counts as an e-bike anymore. I used to know. Is this an e-bike or a motorcycle? How many people would look at this quickly and say, definite e-bike? Just like a bicycle, but with a battery. How many people would look at it if it was moving quickly with this gentleman riding it and say, motorbike, motorcycle? It is not clear to me exactly. Now, I know for sure it's an e-bike. Why is it an e-bike? Because are there pedals? I think there's pedals. So there's your feature. There's your criterial attribute. If it has pedals, it's an e-bike. But you know as well as I do that there are lots of people who ride e-bikes that have pedals for show only. And they ride them as if they were motorcycles. So they treat them like motorcycles. So an e-bike is both like a motorcycle and a bicycle. So a prototype, especially as this is an evolving category, a few years ago, you might not have seen e-bikes that look quite like this, with a seat that looks a little bit like a motorcycle seat, and fat tires that look like motorcycle tires, and attributes that resemble much more a motorcycle. Here is my best attempt to ask ChatGPT free version to create a cluster of motorcycles on the left, bicycles on the right, and e-bikes in the middle, such that the categories appear to be non-linearly separable. I think that's exactly the prompt that I gave it. And this is what we have. And so you can see there's e-bikes kind of in the middle, but some of them do kind of move over into motorcycle space. This is definitely a motorcycle. This is definitely a motorcycle. Definitely a motorcycle. Definitely a bicycle, bicycle, bicycle. But some of these, which sort of appear in that middle space, are more ambiguous. And so this might be an example of a real-life, non-linearly separable set of categories. You might have a pretty clear concept or a prototype for what a motorcycle looks like, and you might have a pretty clear concept and a prototype for what a bicycle looks like, but your e-bike prototype might be somewhere in the middle in a way such that it might not be able to correctly classify everything quickly. So at least on visual attributes alone, it might not be a perfect prototype. If you learned your concept, however, by representing individual exemplars, rather than trying to abstract what's generally true about e-bikes, you just, every time you saw one and you knew it was an e-bike, you said, that's an e-bike, that's another e-bike, that's a bicycle, that's a motorcycle. Your exemplar-based representation might be able to correctly classify these things a little bit more accurately. So that's what a linear separable versus non-linearly separable category is supposed to be. Something that has a clear boundary or a clear definition, a clear gap between the concepts. If I were to remove the e-bikes from this, you might see a gap, a space, a clear definition between what visually appears to be a motorcycle and what visually appears to be a bicycle. But would you add that in between group where they are bicycles that have motors, they just happen to be electric motors, then it's not clear. It's less clear visually what these might be. Does that help at all with the idea of linear and non-linearly separable categories? And so the point is a prototype could still be used to represent the concept. It just might not be able to represent the concept in a way that correctly classifies everything all the time. You might make mistakes more often. You might misclassify some of the fatter tire e-bikes into the motorcycle category. Does that help it seem more clear? So combined with my less clear example from last week, do you think that helps? So the kind of questions, how might I ask about linear separability on an exam? Well, one of the most common questions I've used is, according to prototype theory, what kind of categories would be difficult to represent? And you might say non-linearly separable categories. I might then ask why, and you would say that they have exception items that appear to share features with a prototype of a different category, or they're not similar enough to their prototype to be reliably classified. So a question like that is the type of question you might see on an exam. So asking about the relationship between prototype theory and its ability to predict learning in linear and non-linearly separable concepts. Prototype models predict good learning for linearly separable categories, but not for non-linearly separable categories.
So for like these features that you're talking about that they're not similar, could we just say they're exemplars then?
You could say an exemplar-based representation would be able to capture the relationship among these concepts more accurately. That's how I would say it. Alternatively, I might ask you to give an example of your own or an example from class about what a linearly separable category might be like. You could use this one, and it would be a perfectly good answer. You could use an example like the one that I used at the end of class last week, and that would also be a perfectly good answer. Okay? All right, so let's move on now to language and thinking. And I want to start with, we're going to spend maybe the next 20 to 25 minutes talking about what language is from both a linguistic perspective and also from a cognitive and mental perspective. So what makes language a specific thing that we want to study? We've already been discussing thinking as a process that takes into account perceptual similarity among the events that you experience. So you experience events, you perceive objects, you represent them according to similarity, you form concepts, and you use those concepts in your memory to be able to think about things. And we did describe a system 1 and a system 2, and we said that system 2, which is a slower way of thinking, depends on language. We also said that many concepts are defined by your ability to describe them with language. Memories are retrieved by your ability to describe them with language. So a lot of the thinking that we do is language-based. So I want to talk a little bit about what language is and what it isn't, and then talk a little bit about language in non-human species. We'll talk a little bit about language in chimpanzees and non-humans. We'll talk about non-human communication, and then we'll talk about language and thinking. Take a little bit of a break, then we'll talk about linguistic relativity and linguistic determinism, the idea that your language determines the way you can see and perceive and interact with the world. So at the beginning of the textbook chapter, I talk about some design features. This is from Charles Hockett, who was a linguist in the 1960s. And his idea was that language differs from other cognitive skills, differs from other means of communication in sort of 13 or so critical ways. And when I say it differs from other means of communication, I just mean that all sorts of species and animals, plants, etc., communicate. Plants obviously communicate with each other. They communicate with other plants because they know how to reproduce. Non-human animals communicate with each other all the time. Lots of things communicate, but language is a little different from just communication. And these are ways in which Hockett suggests language is different. In other words, he calls them design features. These are features of how you would design a language system. And the first has to do with what he calls the vocal auditory channel, meaning that in all languages, communication involves transfer between vocal and auditory apparatus. Now, you might say, what about American Sign Language? What about sign language in humans? Sign language in humans does not involve vocal auditory channels. However, sign language does make use of areas in the brain which would otherwise be used for vocal auditory communication. And so language use, even in non-vocal auditory channels, makes use of some of the same brain areas. A second one has to do with broadcast transmission and directional reception. So what does that mean? So that means that the signal can be sent out in lots of directions. It can be broadcast. That's literally what broadcast means, right? So you cast something out broadly to lots of different people. Exactly what I'm doing right now. I'm standing at the front here talking in a way that everybody out there can receive, but you're the only person listening to it. From your perspective, it's directly received by you. So everybody is hearing my message, but you might receive it in a slightly different way depending on your specific background. So even though I say the same thing, Hopefully you perceive the same thing, but we don't always perceive exactly the same thing because we have different linguistic backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, different social backgrounds. Some of you may be paying attention in different ways, and so you might miss something. So the signal can be sent out in many directions, but it's perceived in only one direction. Each one of you perceives it individually. It's also rapidly fading and transitory, meaning that as soon as the linguistic content reaches your ear, it disappears from the world. There isn't anything else left. Which is kind of weird when you think about it. I think for me it is, that the sound of my voice, when it enters your ear, enters your auditory system, eventually activates your auditory cortex, it's kind of absorbed from the universe. It's no longer present. That energy is gone from the universe forever, unless you choose to represent it in your cognitive system. So it fades really quickly. As soon as you hear it, it's gone forever. It's interchangeable. A speaker of a language can reproduce any message that they can understand. So as long as you can understand what I'm saying, you can reproduce the message, even if you do it in a slightly different way, with maybe slightly different words or different accent or your own voice. If you can understand what I'm saying, you can reproduce what I'm saying. Does that make sense so far? By the way, yes.
How does that first one and then this one we just discussed, the third one, how does that work with written language?
So how does it work with written language? That's a really good observation. So one of the things that's interesting about human language is that it is a spoken language. Most of us, all of us, learn how to speak our native language without really being trained to do it. It just happens. But we do have to be trained how to read and write. Lots of human societies can be flourishing without written language. We don't have to learn how to write. It's a way to represent or cognitively offload what we're already designed to do. What we're designed to do is to talk and to listen. We can also offload a little bit of that and make something less transitory by writing it down. Then we've got the message later, but that's a secondary skill that builds on our initial skill of being able to speak and interact with people. So yeah, we all learn how to speak and we all learn how to communicate with language, but you have to be taught how to read and write and to become literate. It's an added on extra feature to language. Good question. So total feedback, the speaker hears everything that they say. Everything that I say, I can hear. So if I'm speaking to you, I know you can hear it, but I can also hear it too. And that means that we're all getting the same information. Specialization, the vocal apparatus used in speech, is specialized for speech production. And this is where it also is co-opted to some degree by speech perception, by language perception, even among people who aren't using spoken language to communicate. If you're using sign language to communicate, you're still using some of these specialized areas, but just in a different way, with a different medium. Is that good so far? These are short definitions. These are the kinds of things you can imagine a multiple choice or a fill in the blank type question on an midterm exam. Some other things, semanticity. Language has semantic content. It's not just noise or gibberish, it means something to us, and that's how we perceive it. Without the ability to perceive something that you understand, without the meaning, this transitory signal would be completely useless. If you don't understand what's being said to you, you can't reinterpret it or represent it internally. You can imagine, you know you're hearing something, but you don't know what you're hearing, and so that transitory signal fades really quickly. Language, unlike a lot of other forms of communication in non-human species, it's arbitrary in the sense that the sounds that we use to represent concepts, ideas, objects, and so on are completely arbitrary. Those are the sounds we know how to make as a species. And so we make a lot of them, and we use them to label all sorts of things and ideas and actions, behaviors, motions, objects, concepts, and so on. But they're arbitrary, which is why there are so many languages in the world. No particular sound needs to refer to a particular object. This is not true of non-human species. Non-human species are much less arbitrary. An alert signal is an alert signal, and it has only one meaning for all members of that species. Discreteness, it's composed of discrete finite sets of units. We only have so many sounds we can make, and so we have to combine them in lots of different ways. We can refer to things that are not immediately present with displacement. So I can talk about things that aren't here. I can talk about the weather outside even though we can't see it. I can talk about things that happened yesterday even though they're gone in the past. I can talk about things that might happen in the future even though they haven't happened. So we can displace things with our language. We can produce a lot of things. It's a very productive system. It's a finite set of units is capable of producing an infinite set of ideas. We only have so many sounds we can make. The point that we wanted to make up here in discreteness. But there's no limit to the amount of concepts and ideas and things that we can discuss. Finally, let's do the last two here. Traditional transmission. Language is transmitted by tradition, teaching, observation, and learning. So it's something that is transmitted in different cultural groups. So you learn to speak the language that you're raised in. You have a native language, the first language that you're exposed to. You may grow up in, how many of you have grown up in a multilingual household with family members that speak different languages, or that you speak more than one or two or three different languages? And that's pretty common to grow up in a multilingual family. But for most of us, even in multilingual families, there's one language that our parents speak to us most, and they speak to us first. And that usually becomes your native language. It might be a blend. Your native language might be a blend of different languages because your parents might speak to you in a blend of different languages. But that's kind of your native language. So when I say your native language, I mean the language that your parents speak to you, the language that you speak to your parents, the language that you think yourself when you have an inner discussion. That's your native language. Finally, this duality of patterning, a small number of meaningless units, which we won't have too much time to talk about how this all breaks down, but eventually, when you break down language into smaller and smaller sound units, they're all completely meaningless. So in our language, and that we're speaking here, English, the language that I speak, that's my native language, there's 20 some sounds that I can make. I can make more than them, but most of them aren't meaningful in English. And all the words can be broken down into those distinct phonemes, those distinct sounds. But eventually, anything smaller than that, smaller units, doesn't have any meaning for me. And that's true for all languages. You break it down into enough small enough components, the meaning starts to disappear. So these 13 design features are a good way to think about what language is. And you can see that they kind of group together in themes. There's a couple of these themes that talk about the arbitrary, discrete nature of them, the small sounds or the small units. There's a couple of themes that talk about how it's transmitted, how you learn to speak language, and how it's spoken in a way that broadcasts but fades really quickly. So a lot of these are thematic in nature. Lots of non-human animals can use pretty sophisticated types of communication. And in some cases can learn to communicate in something that approximates a human language. So I want to talk briefly about bonobo chimpanzees. So these are a subspecies of great apes. And bonobos are chimpanzees, but a slightly less aggressive type of chimpanzee. So there's chimpanzees and bonobo chimpanzees. And the bonobos are a little bit, I guess, milder temperament, which means that if you're trying to study how non-human primates can communicate, bonobos are a little bit easier to study because they're less aggressive towards each other, less aggressive towards caretakers and so on. And Kanzi is one that grew up in the at Emory University in Georgia. And the whole group around Kanzi's sort of cohort and family have kind of learned to communicate in ways that's almost like language. And what they've done is, and I'll show you a short video afterwards, is that most of these chimpanzees use a keyboard that has a lot of symbols that are distinct. And each one of these, some of them you can see what they mean, like talk or sleep, celery. They don't seem to be organized in any particular way. Burrito, which is good to know that Kanzi's into burritos. So a lot of these have very specific meanings. I'm assuming that the burrito button on Kanzi's keyboard means, burrito me. It's understandable. I wouldn't mind one of those either, a burrito button. So if Kanzi's being, is hungry, wants a burrito, I guess he presses the burrito button, gets a burrito. But they can be combined. So some of these concepts are more abstract, and there are ways to combine different concepts to produce sentences. And what you'll see in the video is Kanzi communicating with his trainer, Sue Savage Rumbaugh. So there's a paper that we're not going to discuss the paper in great detail, but I want to watch the video that sort of describes this. But what they discovered, mostly in the 1980s, but continuing on through the 90s, 2000s, and so on, is at this Yerkes Regional Primate Institute, again at Emory University in Georgia State, is that they've learned how to use these symbols through some training. But once some of the chimpanzees learned how to get a little bit sophisticated with this, they also taught other chimpanzees how to use the symbolic keyboard. And so it kind of suggests that they're learning something like a language, like human language, almost like human language, but not exactly. And what Savage Rumbaugh will talk about in the video is some of the limitations. And she's going to highlight a couple of the things that we talked about in Hockett's design features. So as we watch the video, I'll probably pause it a few times and point out some things and maybe ask some questions. It's only about 5 minutes here. And before I do that, let me see if I can turn off some of the lights. That's actually worse. That's better. Actually, that's kind of good in general. I think I might turn them only halfway back on. Makes it easier to see the screen. Okay, I hope this isn't too loud and there isn't some advertisement. All right, that's obviously too loud. I'll turn that down a bit. Let's make this bigger. So what you'll see at the very beginning is not Kanzi, but one of the younger chimpanzees who's interacting with, I guess, one of the dogs that lives there too. And at the very beginning, you'll see, I forget the name of the first chimpanzee, tries to stomp on the dog, like jump on it, and gets in trouble. And the trainer admonishes the chimpanzee, sort of grabs him by the chin to sort of get him to pay attention. So he's being bad. So you see at the very beginning, the chimpanzees are fooling around too much. They're driving vehicles, all sorts of things. But as we go on, you'll see some of the sophisticated language that's available here. And I'll stop it in a few different places. And he knows he's in trouble, as you can see.
What we have begun to learn is that chimpanzees, and I suspect as well, children, have an intrinsic desire to try to figure out what's going to happen to them next. They want them to be predictable. Visit the river. They'd sort of like to know when they're very particular what everybody's going to do next. And so, because they really want to know this, there's an intrinsic desire to figure out what the language is about. I got the onions in a bowl. Put them in our food and we'll come back and turn the TV on. It's your. You spill.
The chimps have responded well to such a rich environment and show an unprecedented grasp of spoken English.
Make it your friend, sure, Nancy.
In addition to spoken language, they receive a steady stream of nonverbal cues, attention directing maneuvers, and repetition, the hallmarks of the way we speak to young children.
Will you watch this today? I mean, could you watch this today?
And by the way, that's that traditional transmission that Hackett was referring to. So a lot of observation, a lot of direction, attentional cues, speaking in a certain way. So, directly addressing, in some cases, making eye contact. So all sorts of things that lets the chimpanzee know, look, I'm communicating to you. And of course, the chimpanzee, like any other, essentially all organisms want to be able to predict the future. You want to know what's coming next. And if you're a sophisticated organism like a human or a chimpanzee, a primate, you got a lot of mental ability to be able to do that. And so that's what this is about, is saying, coming to understand the language as a way to predict what's happening next in the world.
I'm convinced that the combination of all these at an early age is essential for the acquisition of language. Scientists call this process enculturation.
All right, you're new. You can have. Is.
In the kitchen, in Sue's company, Katsi functions impressively. But like a human, really the ability to understand words. He can match spoken words to programs, but what do they mean? Can he make the connection between words and things in the real world under test conditions? A set of 16 photographs has been selected from the several hundred which represent the nouns in his vocabulary.
Your picture. Your picture. What? Say one more else. But you see my good job. Good job. Maybe you can find something. No. 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 Thank you. Constantly, we're already.
Katsi consistently scores better than 90% with such sets of pictures. A motor test involves Kanzi wearing headphones, so only he can hear which picture is being requested.
And that's, obviously, that's an experimental design, making it a little bit more challenging. So Kanzi hears the request to find the picture. The trainer, Sue, can't give any kind of visual cue. If she's just sitting there asking, she can kind of, nudge over at the melons or something like that. You know that I'm secretly wishing that she would have asked him about squash. And yet, there's no Hubbard squash. I was really disappointed.
Constantly get Sue bananas. That's right. Conzi, give Sue ice. That's right. Conzi, give Sue pears. That's right. Conzi, give Sue.
That last one was
The
easy.
tests on single words are convincing, but how does Kanzi deal with words in combination? How do researchers know he is not just doing the most obvious thing given the range of possibilities available to him? But human language is its creativity, the possibility of expressing an infinite number of ideas. We can understand the meaning of a sentence, even if we have never heard its words in that particular order ever before. Savage Robow set out to test whether the same applied to Kanzi. 600 sentences in all, designed to use different grammatical forms and to be as unpredictable as possible.
And these are examples of productivity, right? This is Kanzi has a limited set of vocabulary concepts, presumably has never experienced giving a dog a shot or putting keys in the refrigerator. So these are supposed to be novel combinations, suggesting that it isn't just matching a single object, a sound to a single object, but can combine objects, carry out behaviors, and see what's happening next.
To do this, Kanzi has to ignore another ball, which is indoors. That Kanzi could comprehend and carry out such instructions is interesting enough. But Dr. Savage Rothbau went a step further. How did Kanzi's understanding of language compare with that of human children? Janine Murphy volunteered her daughter, Aaliyah, to take part in an identical study at the age of 2 years. On some sentence types, Kanzi excelled. On others, the child did better. But by and large, both were correct about 3/4 of the time. So far as comprehension went, Child and Chim were on a par.
Jim, could you take my shoe off, please?
Child and Chim, the ability to understand outstrips their ability to produce language. The girl because of her age, and Kanzi because the chimpanzee vocal tract does not allow.
No, take it off.
It is in what an individual comprehends that we use as the basis for saying that individual is language competent. If they can't speak because of some anatomic reason, we don't say that they don't have language. We say that they can't speak and they need some other kind of medium for that.
You want some milk? Trying to be good.
I will watch a little bit more in just a bit here, but just one last thing I wanted to break in. So the suggestion there is that Kanzi has language ability according to Hockett's design features, but is missing one critical thing, which is doesn't have the vocal apparatus to be able to speak. And so what Dwayne Rumbaugh says is that, that doesn't mean he doesn't have language. It just means that he can't speak. In the same way that a human who can comprehend and appears to be able to use language and understand language might not be able to speak, and so uses a different way to communicate. In some cases, that might be sign language, could also be written language, and in Kanzi's case, it is pressing buttons on a keyboard. But the language, the ability to combine concepts appears to be present in both.
For a long time, it was thought that only the human brain could understand human speak. Nevertheless, Kanzi's brain can understand human speak, which says very clearly that something important happened in our evolution. Our brains were able to understand speech, and suddenly our mouths became able to produce speech.
The sudden emergence of speech from a hawk, which would have had, like the ape, only a potential for language, may be linked with our unique anatomy.
I suspect that there's something very unique about the human bipedal posture and the human vocal laryngeal apparatus. One of the things that we know it enables us to do is make sounds like da, sounds that we call consonants. Kanzi can't make these kinds of sounds. His sound is body. Mostly vowel sounds. To another, using all vowel sounds, they can't understand me.
Kanzi often tries to copy human speech, but analysis of the voices of human no show. The human brain shows the boundaries of the words clearly, where Kanzi's are blurred.
We tried to invent a language for kanji that was composed only of vowel sounds, and we couldn't understand ourselves.
Okay, I'm going to stop here because it mostly just continues on with the same idea. You could suggest watching the rest, but the main insight here that she's leaving with is that lots of sound can be produced by the chimpanzees, but there's no way to stop the sound. There's no way to segment it into units. Those units are the concept, or the concepts. The consonants let you have words, let you have ideas, let you have whole concepts that you can understand.
Like that?
Yes, so it's a great question. Was Kanzi able to show displacement? In the example where Kanzi was asked to get the ball outside, suggests there's some degree of displacement there. As the narrator suggested, he was had to ignore the ball that was right next to him and remember that there was a ball outside that he couldn't see, ignore the one and sort of inhibit the tendency to want to go to the ball that's the closest and get the ball outside. So Kanzi knew there was a ball outside, had memory for the ball outside, and was able to think about it when instructed. So that's a great question. So the question is about displacement. Any other quick questions? Yeah.
About the vocal and auditory channels, since we talked about sign language and how they're able to activate the same area that produces the verbal language, was Kanzi's ability to press keyboards also activating that same brain?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure that that kind of brain imaging work has been done. It's a good possibility that some of those same areas would be used. The big difference is that for someone who is born without the ability to hear, someone who is hearing impaired from birth, some of that neural architecture is somewhat plastic, meaning that it can be co-opted or reassigned to communicate in different ways, whereas Kanzi's an adult chimpanzee, and so that degree of neural flexibility isn't likely to be there. In terms of chimpanzees learning language from a young age, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if that research has been done. That's a great question.
Does Kanzi understand syntax?
Yeah, to some degree, Kanzi does understand syntax and can use, to refer to things outside, to refer to things that somebody else has, refer to a friend, or wanting to see a friend, and lots of sort of complex syntactic relationships.
Do parrots have the same vocal, like arbitrary to us or no?
Sorry?
Do parrots have the same vocal, I forgot what you said, vocal.
So, yeah, birds that can speak, so parrots is what you're asking about, have a really different way of, the neural architecture for birds is much different than the neural architecture between chimpanzees and humans. It's not clear that the concepts are being understood in the same way. There's a lot more mimicry with parrots or birds that are learning how to speak. So they can mimic lots of different sounds, including some that sound like humans. It's unclear and unlikely that the same kind of language use is present in a parrot that can learn how to mimic human speech. That's also a good question. Anything else before we go on? Okay, so let's do a little bit more about language structure and then find what seems like an appropriate time for a break, maybe in about 15, 20 minutes or so. Let's go back to language and thought. These are just stills in case the video didn't play, because every so often the connectivity in here doesn't work, so I could at least use this to discuss what Kanzi is doing. Okay, so let's talk just a little bit about some language structure and how it interacts with thinking. So I'm going to go through these pretty quickly because these are all fairly straightforward concepts that I talk about in the textbook. But number one, we've got the problem of comprehension. And that just suggests that for anybody who's producing language, which is me in this case as the speaker, or Sue Savage-Rumbaugh in the case of Kanzi, has a thought or an idea. And we might refer to this as the deep structure. I know what I want to say. I've come up with a concept, I have an idea. Maybe you have the same, right? When you're saying something to somebody, you know what you want to say. You don't just speak words arbitrarily. You have an idea, you have a concept. That's the deep structure. That's a structure that sort of would be part of your mental representation. Those are the concepts. You then turn those using a variety of different brain mechanisms into words, phrases, and sentences to express that thought. And it's amazing how quickly all humans can do that, right? So even young children who are just learning how to speak can do it really quickly. Most of us can speak so quickly that it almost outstrips your ability to think about things. So your speaking and thinking are happening almost simultaneously. Those same speech sounds, though, in the receiving end of things, need to be worked on in reverse. I've got an idea, I turn it into sentences, I make speech sounds, or maybe I write, or maybe I type something, and then that's what you see, or hear, or understand. You get the signal that I've produced, and you've got to sort of work it backwards. You need to take those sounds, put them back onto concepts, words, and ideas. And then from that, try to figure out if you can represent in your mind the same thing that I've represented in my mind. And that's what communication is all about. I've got an idea, a concept, a set of concepts, an opinion, and I want you to have the same concept. I want you to have in your mind the same idea that I have in my mind. And I'm trying to do that through language. So I'm trying to give some insights, and you're trying to take those insights. So we're sort of doing the same thing in reverse. In a conversation with somebody, that happens back and forth really rapidly. Right? So you're thinking about stuff when you're having a conversation with someone. How many of you have had a sort of a heated conversation with somebody, like an argument, and felt like you needed time to get your next point out? It's common, right? Can anybody give me a really good example of having to do this? I mean, sometimes when yeah. Yeah, you always do that, and you're like, when did I do this?
And then you just can't think of like one specific example.
That is a great example. So you always do this. Isn't that just, I mean, how do you react to something like that? You always do this. Like, am I doing it now? Did I do it yesterday? Am I always doing it? Is this what I'm doing all the time? So how do you respond to something like that? You need a chance to sort of come back with something. As when you're having a heated argument with somebody, you're also very emotional, right? And if you're very emotional, you're going to be heightened state of awareness. And of course, you may not hear what the other person says because you want to make your point. That's a lot of complex thinking, where you need to think about what you want to say next, but you also need to think about what the other person said. And so that's why arguments sometimes don't get anywhere when they're heated, right? Because you know what you want to say, and that takes as much effort as you can to put it into words, and you don't have time to hear what the other person is saying. So let's unpack some of these things. We'll go through this really quickly. Surface structure, we're just going to use that term to refer to the actual structure of the message itself. So the words, the phrases, the sound of the language, that's what's on the surface. And what's underneath the ideas are the underlying meaning. So you've got a surface structure and a deep structure, and it's the surface structure that you hear. That's what I produce, and that's what you receive, and you're trying to get the same deep structure. I got a deep structure in my mind, and you're trying to infer that. Lots of ways in which different surface structures can have the same deep structure. If I say this class is boring, or this is a boring class. Slightly different way of saying it, but the underlying deep structure is probably the same. And if somebody said either one of those to you, you would probably draw the same conclusion, draw the same inference. If you say visiting professors can be boring, that could have two meanings. The same surface structure could give rise to two interpretations. Either, if there's somebody who's not your normal prof teaching the class, they're boring, right? They're not as good at doing it. Maybe they don't know how the class runs. Maybe they're just always, anytime you have a visiting lecturer, it's boring. Alternatively, if you visit the professor at their house or in their office, it's also not an interesting outcome. Totally different events, same surface structure. Sometimes surface structures lead to the wrong deep structure. And this happens all the time when you listen to spoken language, that sometimes what people start to say doesn't finish the way you expect it to. And this is referred to in psycholinguistics as a garden path sentence. The idea being that the sentence leads you down a garden path. That's a metaphor, which we're going to get to in just a few minutes here. But a metaphor is an idea that refers to something else. So if I say a garden path, what does that make you think of? What's a garden path? What's the metaphor of garden path before we get to what a garden path sentence is? Anybody have an idea?
In your garden, so you don't step on your plants.
It's a path. Exactly. I mean, that's a literal description. It is a path in your garden, so you don't step on your vegetables. If you have a garden that is formal in the sense that it's like a decorative garden, so like maybe in a city environment or in the backyard of a large house or something, suppose you have a formal garden, and maybe there's a path like through a park. And that path leads somewhere, and you don't exactly know where it's going to lead. And suppose it leads to a dead end. You've been led down that garden path, and then you get to the end and you're like, wait, I'm in the middle of the garden here. How do I get out? I certainly don't want to step on anybody's vegetables to get out. I'm going to have to turn around and go back out the way I came in. So that's the idea of a garden path. It's a path that leads you, maybe in a park-like setting, in a meandering way to a dead end. Meaning that the only way to get back out is to turn around and walk back out the way you came in. You went into the garden, you got to come back out of the garden the same way. So if you have a sentence that does that, so if you know what a garden path is now, and you refer to something as a garden path sentence, it's a sentence that leads you down a certain interpretation from its syntax. But when you get to the end of the sentence, it doesn't work exactly the way you expected it to. So for example, the man returned to his house was happy would strike most people as a sentence that's a little bit awkward. The man returned to his house was happy. Sounds a little bit off, doesn't it? So one interpretation, and the idea is that as you hear words, because the signal is transitory, because it fades really quickly, you've got to put together those words using syntax, using your knowledge of how language works. And you need to put those words together so that you can build a mental model of what the person is saying and map it onto ideas and concepts as quickly as possible, because remember, those words are going to disappear from the universe as soon as you've heard them. So you need to do this quickly, meaning that you need to make assumptions about what's going to come next. And when you hear the man returned to his house, you expect a period, don't you? The man returned to his house. And then if you hear was happy, it sounds like it doesn't fit. And so what we would do, if you were to track somebody's eye movements when they're reading this sentence with an eye tracker, have you ever been in an eye tracking experiment? A lot of people, a lot of different labs at Western, including mine, have used eye trackers, basically a little infrared camera that tracks exactly where you're looking. If you were to track somebody's eye movements when they're reading this sentence, they would go to here, and then they would go back again to reread it, suggesting that when they got to the word house, they had been led down the garden path. They expected that sentence to end, and then was happy leads to an alternative conclusion. So what does this sentence mean? It doesn't mean the man returned to his house, meaning the man, under his own power, just walked back home. What does it actually mean?
Returned by somebody else to his house.
He was returned by someone else. So imagine somebody, let's say, with Alzheimer's disease, who walked out of his house and went missing. And the police were called. And they picked him up a little bit too far from his house, and he was confused. And they helped him get back home and returned him to his house, at which point he was happy because he was returned to his house. So this is a different interpretation of the sentence. So the idea of a garden path sentence suggests that as we hear things, we start to build a model of that sentence as quickly as possible. Now that seems straightforward, but the way to show that experimentally is to create sentences like this, for which you would predict an alternative interpretation at some point, suggesting that the person has built a model in their mind, the model doesn't work, they have to go back and reinterpret the sentence. Lots of different examples. The man whistling tunes pianos. The cotton clothing is made of grows in Mississippi. These sound like really awkward sentences, and you have to read them a few times to figure out what the alternative meaning is. The tomcat curled up on the cushion seemed friendly. The author wrote the novel was likely to be a bestseller. The author wrote the novel should be a sentence. But this means the author, a different author, wrote that some other novel was likely to be a bestseller. So what it means is that when we're hearing sentences, we're trying to parse that sentence and build a representation as quickly as possible. And sometimes we make mistakes. That's a theme in this class. Sometimes you make mistakes. And if you make those mistakes without realizing it, then you have other mistakes that you might make. You might interpret things differently. You might not know what somebody is saying to you, meaning that you might be able to be misled. So let's talk about thinking and language. Let's do this for about 10 minutes and then we'll take a break. Is everybody okay to go to maybe 10:45? Is that okay? I understand this is a long class. So let's talk about quickly language and thinking. Language use influences how and what you think about. The way in which you label things activates a concept. It activates memories, and it means you interpret things in specific ways. We resolve ambiguity, like with that garden path, but we make inferences, predictions, and metaphors. So Fox News, which is the US news channel, which is sort of a little bit more on the conservative side of the news spectrum in the US. There's no direct alternative maybe to that in Canada, but you all know what Fox News is, right? And you might find that it's aligned with sort of the Trump administration, more or less, as opposed to other news outlets. When Fox News was first on the air, about 20 some years ago, their slogan was Fox News Channel, fair and balanced. What is the immediate inference that you think you should make when you hear that slogan? What does fair and balanced mean to you? What do you interpret? They're unbiased. So if they're unbiased because they're fair and they're balanced, what are some other interpretations or inferences you might make?
Channels aren't fair and balanced.
Other channels aren't. If they take the time to point out to you, look, we're fair, we're balanced, we're unbiased. You would only do that if you expected it to be different. If that was something special and unique about Fox News, is that they're fair and balanced, it implies that other channels, which at the time would have been CNN, would be unbalanced, unfair, more biased. But they don't say that. You infer it when you read it. And that's the insight here, is that a lot of language causes you to draw your own conclusions. And as we talked about with things like implicit memories, sometimes concepts are activated without you realizing it. And if a concept is activated internally, an availability heuristic of sorts, that information comes to mind and you trust your own intuitions. So if the way something is described causes you to draw a conclusion, well, you don't think that Fox is telling you that everybody else is unfair. You think that yourself because you've made that conclusion, even if you haven't done it explicitly. Maybe you start to think, well, there's a reason why they're fair and balanced. Everybody else clearly unfair, unbalanced, much more biased. Not everybody draws that conclusion, but that's clearly the intent with advertising like this. Have any of you ever read the Family Circus cartoon in the Toronto Star or any of the comics? This is the corniest, most old-fashioned, great-grandparent-like cartoon in existence. Not just because there's an old woman here, but I mean, it is the most homespun cartoon that's ever been written. But I really like this one. I love the Family Circus. Because it gets at the idea of conceptual metaphors, which I'm going to talk about for a few minutes here. What do you do for grandma does not exercise? Here's a guy jogging, presumably in the out past the house there. So he's jogging along, and the little boy says, "Grandma, what do you do for exercise?" "Well, dear, let's see. I jog my memory." That's an expression. You've probably all heard that, right? I got to jog my memory. I climb the walls, I run out of steam, and I jump to conclusions. And what I like about this, of course, is that the kid's imagining it. Literally, his grandmother is running out of steam. He's a little perplexed. She's jogging her memory, running up and down with her. It looks like, literally running her head up and down. She's climbing the walls. You don't want to see that. She's jumping to conclusions, jumping down the stairs. The other thing I like about this is that it gets at a conceptual metaphor that thinking is action. Not just mental activity, but actual physical activity. There are a lot of expressions in English and likely in other languages would suggest that different kinds of thinking are really hard work. You don't just jump to conclusions mentally. It's a physical act, right? It requires real energy. You don't just jog your memory because it's an expression, but you have to shake things up to think of something like you jog it. Running out of steam suggests that energy, mental energy, is something like steam energy or electrical energy. That there's this underlying concept that thinking is a real action. It's a real type of metabolic process. It's as hard as any other kind of metabolic process, like running or lifting weights or playing pickleball or anything else, right? Those are activities, and thinking is also an activity, and that's why we describe it as an activity, as hard work. These are what are known as conceptual metaphors. They constrain your thought. A metaphor, again, is an idea that you already have. And common cognitive conceptual metaphors are ones that have to do with ideas that we all sort of understand. So the idea of jogging and memory. We know what jogging is. We know it's an activity. We know what steam is in this case. Steam kind of means some sort of heat or some sort of energy. So those are real ideas. And if we map them onto something else, it becomes a metaphor for that something, how that something else works. In the previous case, thinking works like physical activity and the expenditure of energy. In 2003, now this is 2026. 2003 is before all of you were born, presumably. It's a long time ago, but that happens to be the year that I moved to Canada. That's the year that I took a job at Western University. And it also, the day that I interviewed at Western was in March. And the day that I interviewed happened to be the day that the United States, under the George W. Bush administration, launched an attack on Iraq, ostensibly to do something in relationship to the terrorist attacks that had happened a few years earlier on September 11th in 2001. So they launched an attack. And I only remember this specifically because when I left the US, I got on the plane in central Illinois to fly to Canada, there was no war. And when I got off the plane, there was a war. And I was like, well, this is a little awkward. I hadn't expected this to happen because it wasn't one of these things that was, it's like when the US invaded Venezuela a few weeks ago. When he was expecting it to happen, even though there was a lot of buildup, he didn't expect that that was going to be the news that day, that Nicolas Maduro had been kidnapped, right? So I didn't expect that this was going to happen that day. And it was a little weird to be on a plane going to another country because I hadn't thought about moving to Canada yet. And I thought, well, here I am, and now there's a war. And I noticed something interesting was that CNN and Fox News and other US news outlets had a slogan for it. They called it the war in Iraq, which makes sense, because everything in the US especially, but in general, you got to give it a label. You got to give it a title like it's a movie or something. So that was the slogan. That was the movie title for that event. It was the war in Iraq. And that's what everybody called it on CNN and on Fox News. And I landed and I was watching the news in whatever the hotel was off Richmond Street. And they called it the war on Iraq, which is different, even though it's only different by one letter. It's a totally different concept. What does the first concept imply? If you hear something, CBC referred to this as the war on Iraq, what does that sound like to you?
War against Iraq.
It's a war against Iraq. So the United States attacked a sovereign country. They attacked Iraq and sent missiles, ground troops, and everything else there. That sounds hostile. That sounds aggressive. What about the war in Iraq? It's just there. The war was going on, and we just happen to be fighting it here now. Sorry for the inconvenience, but we just happen to be in Iraq today. Those are really different meanings, and I'm sure it's not unintentional. I'm sure it's intended that the US, whether it was Fox News or CNN or CBS or any of the other news networks, referred to it as a war in Iraq. It's easier to get Americans on board with that if you make it sound like, well, this is part of a larger war, and we just happen to be in Iraq right now. But at the time, which, again, this probably precedes all of you, Jean Chrétien was prime minister and was very much against this action. Canada broke from the US at that point and did not support the war on Iraq. And so it wasn't unusual for CBC and other Canadian news outlets to refer to it in slightly more aggressive ways that did not suggest that Americans had maybe attacked another country, which they had at the time. So it's a one-letter difference, but it means a lot the way in which you understand it. So it's directing how you think about it. These metaphors constrain thought. Let's go for just a few more minutes. I'm going to talk about George Lakoff's. Actually, you know what? I'm not going to go for a few more minutes, because if I do this, I'm going to have to do this, 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 and this. And that is going to go too far. So let's stop right here, because that's going to take about 10 more minutes to get to all of conceptual metaphor. And I feel like a break is probably better. Let's take a 15-minute break and then pick right back up where we left off. I'm just going to pause this real quick.
And then my dad.
Like it's stressful.
Those two. Oh, so there's a new, yeah, like there's a new show coming out.
Yeah, so. Yeah, that's true. I also still feel lost.
All right, let's continue. I apologize for breaking off mid-slide, but it didn't seem like it was going to work out to sort of get done before a reasonable break time. So before I continue, I do want to try to complete today's lecture by 12:15 at the absolute latest. And I normally have time after lecture to answer questions, but I don't think I do today. There's a couple of reasons. One, I have a different meeting at 1 o'clock. So I have an advisory meeting for a grad student at 1 o'clock that I need to get back to my office for. I also want to make sure I've checked the settings on your quiz, because I'm confident now that I did not take the time limit off. But I'd like to take that off before it opens at 12:30. So my goal is to finish at 12:15 and to go as quickly to my office as possible. So if that means like seems like I'm hustling out of here, that's the reason why. I do have office hours today. If you can't make my office hours and you do have questions prior to the exam next week, you can contact me by email. You can also contact one of the teaching assistants by email as well. And hopefully I'll be able to get to any questions between now and the exam coming up. Finally, there's one topic at the very end of today's lecture called language and thinking. It's thinking as a language as a window into thought. It's an interesting topic. I don't know if I'm going to get to it today. Don't think I have any questions on the final exam about it, or sorry, the midterm exam about it. So if we don't get to it, I might skip past that last bit because I do feel like I'm a little bit behind today. But we'll see what we can do. Is that all right with everybody? So we left off with the idea of a conceptual metaphor. Conceptual metaphor is a whole theory that was put forth by a linguist named George Lakoff. George Lakoff has this idea that metaphors are how we think in just about every way. Almost all of our language is metaphorical. Metaphor, we know what a metaphor is. It's when something means something else. But in Lakoff's conception, most of the language we use means something else. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute. But the example that he's most closely associated with is the idea of an argument being a war. Now, has nothing to do with the war in Iraq. But the idea is that when you have an argument with someone, it's a discussion. Usually it's a discussion. Sometimes there's yelling. Sometimes there's no yelling. Sometimes it's just a discussion back and forth, trying to convince somebody. But his suggestion is that when we talk about arguments in English, and this would be true in other languages, but we're just going to do this in English now. When you talk about having an argument, you use expressions that are warlike in their origin, suggesting that behind the idea of an argument, where you get these phrases from suggests that in your mind is this metaphor that an argument is actually a little tiny war that you're having. Here's his evidence, and we'll do a couple of these, and then we'll move on to a couple of others. But you'll see what I mean about conceptual metaphor theory. Once you start thinking about language as a metaphor for something else, it's really hard to think about language in another way. So here are just some examples from one of his books. And these are expressions that you might use if you're talking about having an argument with somebody, that their claims are indefensible. That's a warfare metaphor. Defense. You're defending your territory. So indefensible means you've left your territory without defense, right? So this is just talking about having an argument. Somebody makes claims, they can't defend them. That suggests that there's this idea behind it, that the argument you're having is actually warlike. He attacked every weak point in my argument. So if you go on the attack, and you've seen all of those videos, you know exactly what I'm talking about, whether it's on YouTube, TikTok, or Reels. So-and-so destroys liberal idea, right? You know exactly what I'm talking about when I say that, right? So liberal destroyed by comments. Jordan Peterson destroys ideas, that kind of thing. So it's like a war mentality, but it isn't really a war, it's just an argument. And that's what Lakoff's point is that when we talk about things, we have these concepts, and maybe we don't know that we have them there, but they influence the things that we say. His criticisms were on target. I demolished an argument. I never won an argument. If you use that strategy, he'll wipe you out. He shut down all my arguments. So you know what so you get the idea here. Underlying these expressions is a conceptual metaphor, a concept for which one thing, warfare, stands in for another thing, which is a verbal argument or a discussion. And we see these in lots of other examples. The idea of time and money. You can waste time, you can save hours, you can spend time, something can cost you an hour. You can invest time in someone. You can budget your time. And the reason is that because time is a limited resource and money is a limited resource, they can be interchangeable. There's something that holds them together. Something about the way we think about time is similar to the way that we think about money. And for most of us, money is something that it takes time to acquire. So there's a direct relationship between time and money. If time is money, you can spend it. If it's a limited resource, you can run out of it. If it's a valuable commodity, you can lose it or gain it. Or save it in some way. So does everybody get the idea? So that language suggests that you think about the world in very specific ways, and a lot of these are cultural. In the textbook, I talk about a study that was done in Michigan a long time ago. This is probably back in the 1980s, maybe the 1970s. A study was done in Michigan, and the climate in Michigan is equally as bad as the climate here. Meaning that in the wintertime it's cold and damp, and in the summertime it's hot and humid. So you kind of need to have your HVAC pretty well established. You've got to have heat and you've got to have air conditioning. And what Kempton noticed is he interviewed people in Michigan, homeowners. Now this is a long time ago in the sense that thermostats for many people, how many of you have programmable thermostats or smart thermostats like Nest thermostats that just kind of do something and you kind of hope that they get things right? And they kind of learn when you come home and that sort of thing. So most of us have thermostats that we can program. I do not have a Nest thermostat, mostly because I'm paranoid that Google owns them. And if I criticize Google, it'll turn the heat up and boil me alive in my home. So I don't want my thermostat listening to me and adjusting the temperatures to punish me. But I do have a programmable thermostat that you can put in, like when I'm going to be gone, turn the heat down. And I did this many years ago, long before the COVID lockdowns. Set it so that when I leave the house in the wintertime, it gets cooler. Why should the furnace be running when there's nobody there? But of course, during COVID, there was somebody there, and every summer, every winter, we would think, why is it so cold during the day? It took me like 2.5 years to realize that I hadn't actually set it back to understand that we were going to be home during the days. So what he did when he interviewed people, in the olden times, thermostats were not programmable. They were usually a rotary dial, and you could turn them up to turn the temperature up, turn them down to turn the temperature down. And he realized that people had two metaphors, two ideas of how they thought the thermostat actually worked. So this is their metaphor for the physics of the thermostat. And about half of the people conceived or thought of their thermostat as a switch. They used the switch metaphor. So to think of your thermostat as a switch metaphor, it is something that turns the heat on and then it turns the heat off. Doesn't matter what you do with it temperature-wise, it just sets the switch point. How many of you think of your thermostat as something that is just on-off? It doesn't increase. How many of you think of your thermostat as something more like the valve or accelerator, that the more you turn it up, the hotter the temperature gets? All right, that's more common. Now, there are some cases where that might be true, but for the most part, the thermostat is a switch and not an accelerator. It determines when your furnace is going to turn on. The amount of heat that comes out of your furnace, especially if you have the most common kind of furnace in most places, which is forced air or a radiator style, gives off a certain amount of heat. And the key thing is that when Kempton was interviewing people, they had forced air furnaces, furnaces that turn on and off. The amount of heat that comes on doesn't have anything to do with the thermostat. It's just how long it runs. So if you thought of your thermostat as a switch, you thought, well, I'd like to be this temperature. I'll just set it. And then here's what we see is actual thermostat setting is the line, and the actual temperature is the dot. People who thought that their thermostat in their mind was a switch, that it just had some sort of direct feedback, it was a feedback switch model, didn't mess around with it very much. In other words, they said, well, I'd like it to be 22.5 degrees, and they set it at that. Maybe sometimes they felt like their switch was off, and so maybe they turned it a little bit at the morning, but by and large, they didn't change it very much. It stayed at around 22 degrees from the beginning of the day to the end of the day. These individuals actually used less heating fuel. I just stepped on a piece of salt. That's what that sound was. And everybody wondered what that crack. It was not one of my bones. Just because I'm 56 doesn't mean my bones are cracking. Stepped on some salt right there. Sorry to distract. So the feedback switch model, they didn't use as much fuel. They actually had lower utility bills. So the implication here is that sometimes your metaphor for how the world works affects your behavior, and sometimes that behavior affects how you pay for things. People who had the valve and accelerator model, those people who believed that the higher they turned their thermostat, the more heat would come out. And in this case, it was the wrong metaphor, by the way, because everybody had a switch model thermostat. You can see what they did. They woke up and turned it up. Oh, it's too hot. Turn it back down. Turn it back up again, way up. Then turn it back down again. Turn it up and down. Don't do anything. Then turn it down because it's too hot. Turn it up because it got too cold. They're constantly moving it up and down, and they're using more fuel as a result. So they thought metaphorically of their thermostat in a different way. They used different language to describe how it worked, and so they understood it in a different way. This suggests that the metaphors that you have for things can affect your language, they can affect your behavior, and they can affect how much things cost in this particular case. So having the right metaphor in this case lined up with reality, and it meant that your heating was more efficient. Having the wrong metaphor did not line up with reality. You talked about things in the wrong way, and you treated them the wrong way. Metaphors frame discussion, and they direct your thinking. We saw this last year and throughout the year when Ford ran for re-election on the Canada is not for sale platform. Greenland is not for sale. And so there's a lot of slogans that you see politically, not just in Canada, in the United States, and on the world stage in general. And you're probably all familiar with this. Maybe even some of you have one of these hats. Of course, the metaphor here is that it's taking off from the Make America Great hats. Make America Great. Canada is not for sale. One joke that was made was like, how do you reconcile these two metaphors? Ontario is open for business, but not for sale. So you've got to try to use both metaphors simultaneously. This is for a specific message for a different government. This is a more general policy that suggests you can still do business in Ontario. You see a lot of this in terms of how the tariffs were sold to Americans about a year ago. Public statements, the president neglects the reason, suggests that we pay billions of dollars to subsidize Canada. We don't need anything. Therefore, Canada should become our cherished 51st state. Subsidy refers to a trade deficit. The president says, I'm doing this because of fentanyl trafficking. How many of you remember that one from that idea from a year ago? That the tariffs that were placed on Canada about a year ago were either put in place to stop subsidizing, to bring revenue in, or to stop the flow of fentanyl from the United States into Canada. So the discussions or the metaphors that are used to direct thought in very particular ways. If the intended message is economic, you can use economic language. If the intended message is national security, then you might use drug trafficking language. We'll go past this one because it's just an extended description of the same idea. At the same time, renaming geographical areas like the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America. It's not clear to me, is anybody here from the US? You know that I'm originally from the US. Is anybody else from the States? Do you know if anybody in the US refers to the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America? Or is that past? Does anybody refer to it as the Gulf of America?
Depends where you are in the US.
Depends where you are? I think so. Yeah, I don't know that anybody uses this term. This was a big deal about a year ago, and then it seems to have kind of faded from interest. But the idea is to direct your thinking, nobody really cares, I think, for most of us, what people in the US want to call the Gulf of Mexico. But the idea is to direct your thinking to maybe align yourself with one political party or the other. And this I don't want to go into too much Donald Trumpism. I feel like Donald Trump takes up too much time and effort for everybody. But just to use this last example, because I think it's something that the Trump administration, both as an elected official the first time around and the second time around, did really well, which is to use language in a particular way. Lakoff, this is again George Lakoff, suggests that President Trump is really good at this particular thing in terms of communication. There's a lot of repetition. When Trump was running for election in 2016, running for re-election in 2020, and then running again 2 years ago, repeats a lot of things. We're going to win so much, we're going to win at trade, win at the border, win so much, you're going to be sick and tired of winning. You're going to come to me and go, please, we can't win anymore. So there's a lot of repetition. And this directs thinking in a particular way. Even if you're not a fan of Donald Trump, you start thinking of the word win. And you start thinking of win with Trump. Are Trump policies winning? Referring to crooked Hillary. This is also from Lakoff's book. So it's from the first time Donald Trump ran for president against Hillary Clinton in 2016, referred to Clinton as crooked. Lots of nicknames. Sleepy Joe Biden, crooked Hillary taps into this cognitive metaphor for untruthfulness. Truth is straight. Hillary is not truthful, therefore uses that nickname crooked. Lots of slogans like "Making America Great Again," loaded with linguistic references implying that it was great in the past, it's not great now, but if we just do this, it will be great again. And again, the idea is to get you to think about things in a particular way, to activate thoughts, to activate concepts, and to activate an availability heuristic or a representative heuristic, so that you come to the conclusion that it was once great, it's not now, and it will be great in the future. So the idea is that language influences thinking, and this is not unique to President Trump. President Trump just seems to do it a lot more effectively than other political candidates. All political candidates are going to try to influence your thinking because they want you to vote for them, right? It's kind of their job. As when they run for office. Have the USC elections happened yet? They have happened. Who's the winner?
Currently, the time for voting close.
This is the voting period? I don't really keep up on this too much, other than to just know that it's happening because there's signs. But do not the candidates try to get you to convince? They try to direct your thinking. This is what I plan to do as USC president, right? So even at the level of USC president, it's something that political candidates want to do, is to get you to cast your vote, to think like them, and to direct your thinking in a particular way. So language influences thinking. Let's spend the rest of the time talking about a very specific model and theory of language and thinking called linguistic relativity. And there are two terms that sometimes get used together. We'll talk about them together, and then we'll talk about sort of a specific version of it. But the idea of linguistic determinism is that linguistic determines what you can think about. That's a strong version of this theory. Linguistic relativity suggests that your native language will cause you to think about things in certain ways, and that there will be differences relative to other languages. So they're both a similar idea, that your native language causes you to think about things in a particular way, but one of them's a little bit stronger than the other. That's a question, I think, on the midterm exams. Which one of these is a stronger version? It's linguistic determinism. Sounds a little bit strong. These are connected with a linguist, most commonly Benjamin Whorf and his mentor, Edward Sapir. The Whorf-Sapir hypothesis suggests that language determines thought and perception. And here's how Whorf framed it in the middle of the 20th century. And I've highlighted or bolded the term cutting nature up because he's referring to the earlier Platonic idea of cutting nature at the joints. So there's a specific reason why Whorf uses these terms. Again, directing your thinking to something that you should know. If you were in Whorf's audience, you would know this idea of cutting nature at the joints. And so this would allow you to connect those concepts in a directed way. So Whorf says we dissect nature along lines laid down by our native language. So that's different than saying that you cut nature at the joints that are naturally there. You cut nature at the lines that you've laid down by the language you learned to speak. The categories and types we isolate from the world of phenomena, we do not find there because they stare every observer on the face. On the contrary, the world is presented in a kaleidoscope flux of impressions, which has to be organized by our minds. Well, who's going to argue with that, right? I mean, there's a lot of information out there and you've got to organize it. And this means largely the linguistic systems of our mind. So Whorf is saying that when we have to organize the world into concepts, we do it linguistically. And if we do it linguistically, we have a native language. And if we have a native language and those languages differ, then we're going to come to different agreements about what we see. We cut nature up, organizing it into concepts and ascribe significances as we do, largely because we're parties to an agreement to organize it in this way, an agreement that holds throughout our speech community, that's your native language, and codified by the patterns of our language. All observers are not led by the same physical evidence to the same picture of the universe unless their linguistic backgrounds are similar. So what that implies is that if people who speak different languages might perceive the world in different ways. And this is a strong prediction in the sense that it suggests we perceive things differently. It turns out to not be as accurate as the weaker version, which is that there are some relative differences which are linguistically constrained. Worf came upon this idea in an apocryphal story, meaning that it may or may not have happened exactly this way, because before becoming a linguist and a philosopher and an expert in this particular field, worked as an insurance adjuster and noticed that at one factory, because he was working for an insurance company and looking at fire safety, that people thought about empty in different ways. So a gasoline can that is empty can be empty in a lot of ways. It can be empty because there's no gasoline in it. In other words, if you're using these canisters of gasoline to fill up something else and they're empty, you can't put any more gas in your vehicle. But are they really empty? So if you say this is empty, but it still has gasoline fumes in it, and you're smoking around it, it could still cause a fire, right? So they're still combustible even if they're empty. And that's one of the things that sort of got this idea started, is that when people refer to these as empty canisters, they were not treating them as if they were empty. They were treating them as if they were empty, and they shouldn't have. They shouldn't have been smoking around them because that could be a health risk. Health risk empty is different than, can I fill my vehicle up empty? And so the suggestion is that language changes the way you perceive things. As soon as you call it empty, you think of it as completely empty. You see this with traffic signals. We know what red is. What does red mean? Red means stop, right? You know what green means. What does green mean? Green means go. What does yellow mean? How many think yellow means stop? How many think yellow means go faster? I mean, that's arguably what it means. How many really know it doesn't actually mean that? But what do you think is your best definition of what yellow should mean? Wait. So wait is kind of stop, kind of go. Okay. Slow down.
Stop if it's safe.
Stop if it's safe. That's close. Others.
Approach with caution.
Approach with caution.
Slow down and cross if it's safely possible to do so.
So slow down and cross if it's safely possible to do so. So taking a perspective of, can't speak today, a pedestrian in this case. Yeah.
It's gonna be red soon, so don't kill anybody.
It's going to be red soon, meaning that people on the other side are going to expect it to be green, because when it's red for you, it's green for the others. A lot of knowledge here. But one of the reasons why, and you could probably not be surprised, that collisions happen on yellow, right? They don't happen on green very often. Sometimes somebody will miss a red light because they're not paying attention, but yellow is dangerous. And one of the reasons it's dangerous is because we don't have a single word for it. We have a single word for stop, we have a single word for go, and we have nothing single for yellow. It is a much more complicated concept. It's difficult to put into words. According to the Highway Traffic Safety Act in Ontario, you must stop if you can do so safely, otherwise go with caution. Even the official definition of yellow in Ontario is very convoluted. I don't still know what I'm supposed to do, because I can stop if I can do so safely. That's great, but I should go with caution, which for many of us means, well, what does that even mean? Does that mean that if it's slippery outside, I need to not stop at all? Because if I try to stop and slow down, I will skid and then possibly go through the red light when it goes through. So I actually should continue going at the same speed. It suggests that accidents are going to happen because we don't agree. We're not party to an agreement about what yellow actually means. So even in our shared Ontario driving community, even if we all conceive of this yellow light with English terms, and even if we see the definition, it's just not as clear. So you can see what I mean by linguistic relativity and linguistic determinism. I got a quick answer. I got a quick answer. It's not clear. It is an unclear answer. So there's two different versions of this, and I'm going to talk about how this came about. We're going to talk about some examples from color concepts and color categories, and I do want to get through the final example, the Roche example, by looking at language and colors, and hopefully get through everything. So I suggested there's a weak and a strong version of this general idea. The strong version, determinism, the structure of anyone's native language strongly influences or fully determines the worldview that they will acquire. Weak version. Structural differences between languages will in general be paralleled by non-linguistic cognitive differences of an unspecified sort. This is Brown and Lenenberg's, also two linguists from the middle of the 20th century. This is their definition. So two people speak two different languages. They've grown up in two different linguistic communities. They might have some other cognitive differences in terms of how they form concepts and of the ideas that they have. Maybe they think about time in a different way. Maybe they think about space in a slightly different way, but they can perceive basic things the same way. Worf's version, the strong version, suggests that you might not be able to even perceive something if you don't have a word for it. Sometimes that's true. It can sometimes be true to an extent with color categorization, color classification. So we're going to see evidence both for and against this strong version. But the reason why color is interesting is that all languages describe colors, right? Languages that have many color terms, languages that have fewer color terms, but there's an interest in describing things by color because it's a really fundamental attribute of the world. Second, it's interesting because we all have the same basic physiology, notwithstanding individuals with specific color blindness. The general anatomy of the human eye is the same across different language groups. Language does not determine how your eye is formed. You've got different rods and cones so that you can, in theory, perceive color vision the same way. The issue is, if you don't have the name of a color, can you perceive it separately from other colors? So I want to talk about three different kinds of research. But first, I want to talk about the linguistic cultural anthropology side of things from Berlin and Kay, Paul Berlin. In the 1960s, looked across many different languages to determine that there was some evolution of color terms. In other words, languages that have come into contact with lots of other languages. In other words, languages that are shared across different cultures. Languages that might have evolved from one group to another group might have lots of other color terms because they've taken in color terms from neighboring linguistic communities. Languages which may have evolved more isolated, in other words, with less contact from other language groups, might have fewer color terms. What they determined was that across all the languages they studied, that there were 11 possible basic color terms. First, we got to describe what a basic color term is. And the idea is that it's the same as a basic level category. It's a color term that it's the first thing that would come to mind. If you see anything that's bluish, you would say blue. You wouldn't say light blue, dark blue, aquamarine. You would just say it's blue. So that's one characteristic of a basic color term. It's one word. It's not light blue, it's blue. It's not included in any other color term. So crimson, or might be a type of red, but it's a type of red. We can all recognize that red is the basic level category. It's not restricted to a narrow class of object. You can use blonde to describe hair color, wood color, beer color, and a few other things. But it isn't a general term that can be applied across the board. It also can't refer to a specific color. So the color of someone's freezer, someone's shirt, or something like that. That's a very specific item that doesn't have meaning across the language group. So you get the idea of what a basic color term is. Green is a basic color term because it can be applied to lots of different objects. It's a basic term. And what they determined as well is that all languages they studied have a term for light things and dark things. So every language they studied have a black and white term. But there are lots of languages, and we'll see one in just a minute, that's an indigenous language in South America, in part of Bolivia, which has only 3 terms: dark things, light things, and red things. That doesn't mean that things don't have color in their universe. It means that they don't have a specific basic level term for anything else other than dark things, light things, and red. If a language, any language that contains 3 terms, red is always the 3rd term. They didn't find languages that have black, red, and blue. They find languages that have black, white, and red. If it contains 4 terms, green and yellow are always the 4th term, but not both. 5 terms, you've got black, white, red, green, and yellow. So there are lots of languages with only 5 basic terms. Those are the 5 basic terms. And I'm using the English language equivalent categories, if that makes sense. Blue doesn't come until you've got at least all of these others. So blue is a late evolving color term, and we'll see a couple of examples in just a bit. But blue for a long time wasn't common in many languages, and it still isn't common in many languages. And then we go on, you can add brown, and then some of these others, pink, purple, orange, and gray, which seem like they're combinations, but in some languages are basic level color terms. So this doesn't mean that the colors don't exist in nature. It means that the colors don't have a linguistic basic level term in whatever native language the individuals speak. So does this all make sense? We got basic level color terms, you got a definition of what those are going to be, and you can think about how they evolve in different languages. So now that you know that, you can think about or study between different groups. So I'm going to talk about a couple of different examples. One has to do with a historical example, and the other has to do with a cross-cultural example. The historical example, I'll just go into briefly. There's a longer podcast you might want to listen to, only if you're interested. I will not ask questions on the exam about the contents of this podcast. But it has to do with the idea that in Homer's Odyssey, which is an epic poem from ancient Greece, and the Iliad, there is no description of anything blue. The entire book has nothing described as being blue. But you can imagine things like the sea, the ocean, being wine dark. And the sheep can be described as being violet, not violent, violet sheep. And it turns out that both recent linguists and historical linguists determined that there is no single reference to blue in Homer's Odyssey, suggesting kind of oddly that ancient Greeks did not have a term for anything blue, which if you're Greek or if you know anything about Greece, blue is a very common color. It's on the flag. So it suggests that ancient Greeks didn't have the term. And if they didn't have the term, then that raises the question, did anything even look blue to them? What they reference, and these are just 2 excerpts, but this is the point that I want to make. You don't really need a word for a color until you can make the color reliably. So one reason why blue in ancient languages seems to have not existed is that blue is more complicated to make as a dye. It's easy to make red things. It's easier to make green things. Green exists in plants and chlorophyll is green. It's harder to make blue things. There aren't a lot of blue flowers. There isn't an easy way to make blue chemically. Cobalt is blue, but you'd have to mine cobalt and turn it into something else. So it's not an easy color for you to make into a paint or something else. You can take a piece of red clay and you can use it as a crayon, and that's why paints made out of ochre go back 60,000 years. And blue is the hardest. For thousands of years, no one had it except the Egyptians. And the Egyptians had their own word for it. And then he says later, when there's a category for that thing, the thing in the category jumps out. It gets louder to your eyes. Once you have a word, you can start recognizing something. The category actually feeds back on your perception so that you notice it more. Without the word, you're still seeing that object. It just, you kind of gloss over it. If you don't have the name blue, you just kind of gloss over it. So this raises the possibility that even though you have the same physiology as someone else, if you speak a language that doesn't have the word blue, and you reliably recognize blue things? Maybe not. Quick question for you. Do you remember this from back in the day? QR code this, by the way, and let me know what color you think this is.
I know it's this wet.
There's some interesting shifts that have happened with time and age. Back before TikTok, this was what counted as entertainment for people, was arguing what color this was.
It was on Vine.
Vine, that's right. Rip Vine. It was the old TikTok.
Did you just say right?
And I have class figure it out.
Let's look what we all came up with here, shall we?
Red.
Okay, so not surprising to me, most of you, though not all of you, see this as the blue-black dress. So the majority of respondents, 60%, almost 60% of you, think that that dress is blue and black, which is, as you know, the correct answer. Actually, it really is a blue and black dress. How many of you think that your knowledge of it being blue and black influences your perception of it, or does it only look blue and black to you? Now, do any of you see it as what's known as a bistable image, where you can sort of see both? Okay, some people can see both. How many of you, well, we already know, 40% of you only see it as white and gold. For those of you that see it as white and gold, do you think that the black-blue people are wrong? And for those of you that are black-blue seers, do you think that the white-gold people are just, what is wrong with you that you see this? Yes. And that's why this was such a fun meme 10 years ago, or whenever it came out. It turns out, interestingly, that there are some physiological reasons, but one of the ones that I'm sort of interested in, or that was interesting to me at the time when I read about this, this is just a side note, I'm not going to ask questions about this, is this a pretty strong age effect. Older people more likely to see it as white and gold. I am an older person. I know it is a black and blue dress, but I cannot see that. It is not bistable for me. It only looks white and gold to me. Even though I know that's false, it is impossible to me. And for whatever reason, older people see it as much more likely to make the white gold respond. Younger individuals more likely to make this change. There are lots of different reasons why people see it. It looks a little bit more black and purple here, but to me it still looks like a white gold dress for whatever reasons. I don't fully understand it, but prior knowledge also plays into it. So if you're non-naive, in other words, if you know what it is, it doesn't really change your effect very much. Some people, even if they're not naive to it, still report it as being white and gold. I am not naive to this. I know the effect. I know the color of the actual dress. I've seen other pictures of the actual dress, but this one looks white and gold to me. Okay, so we know that color is something that's really salient to us and really meaningful because, you know, wars have broken out over less than disagreements between what color that dress actually is, right? You just cannot believe that someone would have the wrong answer. You look at that and you think, this is a black and blue dress. What is wrong with you? How could you possibly think this is a white and gold dress? So there are lots of different ways to cut up the color spectrum. These things that we call colors exist in nature, whether you perceive them or not, because they have to do with the chemical composition of the object and the way it reflects light back to you. That activates rods and cones in particular ways. And then whether or not you have a name for that thing is up to you. But the objects themselves don't change. So if the objects don't change, you can name them in different ways. So we might name this group of things green, and we might pick something at the center, the most green-like. And that might be your basic color, or what we refer to as a focal color. So for most of us, when you're changing the color of something on your screen, if you're changing the color of text or a figure that you've drawn on your computer, a little menu comes up with lots of colors you can pick from, right? And sometimes it's sliders, sometimes it's little crayon icons, but you kind of know what I mean, that there's like greenish things, but then there's one in the middle that always looks like it's the right green. It's the correct thing for green. Everything else is green-like, but there's a really good green, and there's a really good blue, and there's a correct red, and there's a correct yellow. and that most people kind of agree what that correct yellow is. Other languages, we're going to talk about a group of individuals in Papua New Guinea, Bernimo people, and then we'll talk about Siamo speakers in Bolivia, who cut the whole worlds of color up into different slices, depending on how many terms they have. You can take this set of colors, slice it up into 2, 4, 6, lots of different ways to slice it up. The language agrees, but people who speak different languages use different terms. So let's talk about two experiments. This was originally an experiment done by Eleanor Roche, whose name should be familiar to you because she also studied prototype theory. And she was interested in whether or not people form natural prototype-like categories of colors, and studied Dani people in Papua New Guinea who have only 2 words for colors, a light color and a dark color. Live a linguistically rich life, but color doesn't happen to be something that they have basic terms for. Doesn't mean they can't describe objects. It just means that they don't have a basic level term in their language for things other than light things and dark things. Cool dark shades, blue, green, and black all get the same word, and light colors like red, yellow, and white all get the same term. And then in her experiment, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, but the idea of the experiment is you're going to see a color chip. It's a stable color all the time. So kind of like what you would go if you went to the paint store. You go to Home Depot or Benjamin Moore and you pick out one of those little color swatches. It's a nice stable color. You're out in the direct sunlight and it looks the same all the time. And some of these are focal colors. In other words, to you and I, who speak a language that has a term for blue things and for red things, we might say that this is a good blue and this is a good red. These are reddish, but maybe they're not the focal color red. They're sort of boundaries or internominal. They don't have a good name for them. And other things are right on the boundary between colors. So we've got kind of 3 different kinds of colors. Good examples, colors, which might be like prototypes, basic level color terms. Things that don't really have a name at all, we're going to call those internominal, they're between names. And then boundary level colors, things that are on the boundary between one big color category and another big color category. If you speak a language that has terms for these colors, you're going to remember this one more easily than you will this one. And by remember, I just mean you could do this in a couple of ways. You could ask people to learn arbitrary other words like paired associate. Every time you see this color, you learn a separate word for it. You pair them together. That's going to be easier if you already know how to name the color, because you can say blue goes with kitten or something like that. You know, second word, blue and cat. Every time you see them together, you can learn this better because you got a word for it. If one of these colors comes up where it's harder to remember the color because you don't have a word, it's also going to be harder to remember the pair. Another way to test memory is to simply show the color, look at it for a little bit, then show a whole bunch of other colors and say, pick out the one that you saw. That would be a perceptual memory. So here's what Roche did. She did both of these, but we're going to talk about the second experiment. 4 different colors where she looked at focal colors, which she referred to as codable. In other words, everybody in the language has an agreement about what that color should be called. This is green. Nobody with good functioning color vision in that language would give it another name. So focal colors, we all agree that's red. Non-focal colors, we might not agree what the name is, or we might not even have a name for it. And then she asked English speakers and Dani speakers to do a couple of tasks. And I'll show you what those tasks were on the next few slides. So experiment 3, let's talk about, designed in 2 parts. An English-speaking group was tested. This was intended primarily as a replication of an earlier study. So all they want to say is, are there focal colors? Are there colors that everybody agrees on? To derive focal and non-focal colors. A Dani group was tested. This was intended to test the hypothesis that memory differences between focal and non-focal colors exist, even when codability differences do not. So what she's testing is there something special about these focal colors? If there isn't, then the Dani people who don't have a word for blue or green shouldn't care which one the focal color green is. Like there shouldn't be anything special about a really good green if you don't have the term green at all. But if there is something special about basic level color categories, they should show differences in behavior, even if they don't have language differences. Does that make sense? So this would suggest evidence against the strongest version of linguistic determinism. That's what this experiment was designed to test. If this happens, if this outcome occurs, if focal colors have an effect on memory and perception in a language that does not have the terms for them, it suggests that Worf's strong version of linguistic determinism may not hold up, because even without the language, they can still perceive the difference between different colors. Here's how the procedure was run, and I'll show you the example on some slides. Procedures were essentially identical for the US and Donny subjects. S's here just mean subjects. Test chips were mounted, so these are those color chips, on white cards. Subject was shown a single test chip for 5 seconds. So you look at a color for 5 seconds, waited 30 seconds, and then shown an array of 160 colors and asked to select from it the chip he had seen. After the 30-second delay, the 30-second delay was not filled by any activity, was then covered, and then they just did another one again. We're going to measure their response latency, in other words, how fast it takes them to make a response, and whether or not they were correct. So we're testing English people, testing Donny speakers. So here is a color, you get to see it for 5 seconds, it goes away, and then which one did you see? Did that seem like an easy task? So you would have to point to, I guess it's this one. I think that's about right. And that seems pretty easy for most of us because that's a pretty good example of green, right? When I see this, I think green. Okay, whoops, sorry. But when I see this one for 5 seconds, what comes to mind? What's the color name for this? Mustard? I don't even know. I guess I would call it mustard, but where is it? And her point was that for English speakers, it should be easier for us to do the first one, faster and more accurate, because we have the name. We can locate the area on color space because we know it's green. And once we know it's green, it makes it easier to sort of rule out some of the other categories. We get the column and we can say it was probably this one. But when I see mustard, I kind of don't know where it is. And I don't even know if mustard is the right color. And maybe not everybody has that term because it's not a basic level term. That's the basic level advantage. Green, we all got a simple word for it. It's easy to remember. Mustard, maybe it's not as easy to remember because it doesn't have a simple term and it's kind of in a vague area of color space. And so lots of examples. These are examples of basic level categories. These are examples of internominal categories, things that don't quite have a name. I don't quite know what to call these. These might have a name, but they're on the boundary. So those are boundary colors. They're close to the edge. And the boundary just means things on one side are called blue, things on the other side might be called green. So this is yellow, but it's kind of a greenish yellow. And so it's closer to that boundary. You should make a few more errors with it. And that's essentially what her research found. So her research found first a couple of things. American subjects, the English speakers, showed an advantage for focal colors in terms of number correct and also in terms of how quickly they can do it compared to internominal, meaning the ones that are in between names and the ones that are on the boundaries. You were better with focal colors in terms of correct and you could do them faster. Does that make sense to everybody? So the higher number here means more correct. The lower number for latency means you do it faster. Now notice they were better than the Donny speakers. So for focal colors, Americans got 5.25 correct versus 2.05 correct for Donny speakers. But her point is not the overall main effect. It's the lack of interaction. It's the interaction rather. Everybody showed this effect of stimulus color. Focal was better than internominal and boundary colors. And for Donny speakers who didn't have the words, they only had dark and light, still showed a focal color advantage. They were still better at being able to recognize green and blue relative to these other colors in between. That suggests that a strict linguistic determinism doesn't apply to color perception. She writes, in summary, the results or memory accuracy were highly consistent. Focal colors remembered more accurately than non-focal colors by both Americans and Donnie. The difference between internominal and boundary colors was not significant. Not surprisingly, recognition was better. However, it's important to note that there was no interaction between culture and treatment. In other words, the cultural differences, there was a main effect in terms of how good you were. Americans, subjects speaking English did a little bit better in this town. But there was no effect of focal color that was mediated by language. Everyone showed a focal color advantage. Does that make sense? Okay, one other color experiment idea, then we're going to talk briefly about time categories, and then I believe we will wrap things up. It's 11:51, so we're actually on time. This last example shows that things can shift when people acquire a second language. This is a study from much more recent, from 2023, looking at Spanish speakers and Tsimane Spanish bilinguals. Tsimane speakers live in South America, and some of them speak Spanish as well in Bolivia. Others speak their native language, an indigenous language, Tsimane. Bolivian Spanish speakers use 12 color terms consistently for the English equivalents of black, white, red, light blue, dark blue, etc. Tsimane speakers use only a few, like as white, black, and red. So they have a term for white things, a term for black things, and a term for red things, and have no other basic level color categories. And what they were interested in studying is that if one group also becomes multilingual, so if the Tsimane speakers who only have 3 basic terms start to speak Spanish, presumably they learn Spanish language colors, but does it work backwards and affect how they think in Tsimane as well? In other words, do they show focal color effects? This just gives you some basic background. Bolivian Spanish speakers tend to be industrialized, live in the city. Tsimane speakers, non-industrialized, farmer groups in some rural communities. And of course, they interact a lot. There are lots of Tsimane speakers who also speak Spanish. But there are large groups that are primarily monolingual. And they gave them a color naming task. Essentially, participants asked to name all these color chips. You pick a bunch of chips and you just say, what is this called? What is this called? What's the name for it? And not surprisingly, you then ask people to put them all on a group and point as what they would label them. So it's sort of a 2-part naming task. Not surprisingly, if you only speak a language that has light, dark, and red, those are the terms you come up with. Red things, dark things, and everything else is kind of in this light category. But the critical data set here in this case are the bilinguals who, when they're asked to name things in their native language, Tsimane, show Spanish language colors exist. So only knowing 3 terms, they still seem to segment things differently. And so they're naming things more consistently. When they only have the 3 languages in Tsimane, they only name a subset. They don't have names for these things. When they label things in Tsimane, having been exposed to Spanish, they now have names for things. They can apply these names more consistently. They can do it in Spanish, and Spanish monolinguals sort of show this. So suggesting that when you learn a second language that has different color mappings, you can apply that color mapping back to your native language as well. Again, suggesting that basic level perception of colors seems to be somewhat universal, even in cases where there isn't a word in your language. And this is showing sort of essentially in the identification phase. Monolinguals don't really distinguish across all of these things. But once you've learned Spanish as a Tsimane speaker, you can segment the color space much more effectively. Does that seem pretty straightforward? Okay. This also applies to labeling objects. So color, one aspect about color, of course, is that it's physiological. But most people name objects in different ways too. Barbara Malt's work suggests that English speakers, when presented with these objects, will use different terms. These 6 objects might be named jug, might be named container, or jar, depending on the object. this is a bottle, this is a container, this is a jug, this is a jar, etc. For this particular group of 6 might be all named Frasco in Spanish for her participants, suggesting that it's a bigger nominal category. The linguistic category for this is larger in Spanish, and it has a higher grain in English, meaning that it's a smaller level basic categories. So within and across these languages, not everything that's glass is a bottle, not everything glass is a bottle, not everything not glass is not a bottle. That is really a terrible sentence. But I think you understand what I'm trying to say. There isn't a single perceptual feature that lets you know what word to use. You generally form concepts. But what she noted was that although there were linguistic differences, people still group them together in the same way. Spanish speakers who might use the same name for all 6 objects or the whole set of objects still group them together into the same perceptual category. So there's no indication that the language difference changes the way individuals are perceiving that object when they have to make a perceptual match. Does that make sense? If language is the primary director of thought, they should differ, but they didn't, providing evidence against this strong linguistic determinants. Okay, I have one final example that I'm going to do where we talk about time perception and language. We're going to skip over the final thing that I was going to talk about. You can read it if you're interested, but I'm not asking any questions about it on the midterm, because I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about the kinds of questions you're going to see on the midterm. I do ask a question about this one, by the way, so I'll give you that hint. It's not really a hint. I mean, that's what this whole lecture is. I'm basically standing up here for 2.5, 3 hours telling you what might be on the exam. So this might be on the exam. It probably will be. It actually definitely will be. There is a question about this on the exam. So this is Lyra Boroditsky's research, and her research is what you might describe as a neo-Whorfian. In other words, still really interested in how language influences how you think about things and how you perceive things, but suggesting a lot more flexibility than Whorf might have originally suggested. So Boroditsky points out that we have metaphors for talking about time. Every language has metaphors for talking about lots of things. And in English, most of the metaphors tend to be horizontal. Not all of them, but many of them. You push deadlines back and you move meetings forward. So time is on an x-axis for a lot of English-speaking metaphors. And the metaphors, the evidence for those metaphors are just the expressions that we use. You go forward in time and back in time. You can go back to the future and you can jump ahead to the next day. So you can see this horizontal x-axis time. Mandarin speakers, a lot of linguistic metaphors suggest a verticality, or at least paying attention to the vertical nature, meaning that things can go up and down in terms of time, which you can certainly see evidence of both in both languages. Calendars in English, the top of the month to the bottom of the month, right? So that's what I mean by a vertical axis to time. You can certainly imagine this being connected to the written form, in English being a left to right written language. That's an x-axis horizontalness, and writing that isn't strictly horizontal, that might have some vertical characteristic to it. It takes you time to get from the top of the page to the bottom of the page, right? So that's the connection here. This doesn't mean that time perception changes. It means that the relationship between language and descriptions of time might be more vertical in one language, might be more horizontal in the other language. She tested this in a fairly straightforward way by showing participants a visual prime. The visual prime is supposed to emphasize verticality or horizontalness. So you don't see the description here, but you might just see the picture. And this picture might say to most people, it's something vertical, right? Because the black ball is on top of the white ball is below. It makes you think about verticalness, right? It's a vertical picture. It's vertically oriented. The two objects are on top of each other. Whereas these two objects are beside each other, it's horizontal and one is moving in a direction. So black ball's on top of the white ball, the black ball is ahead of the white ball. So if you see that image and then you're asked to make simple proposition, to confirm or disconfirm simple statements in your native language, March comes earlier than April, for example. First suggestion was that if you're already primed to think horizontally, and the language you're interacting with is one that has more metaphors for time that are horizontal, like English in this case, you would be faster to say yes or no. If you see a vertical prime and the language that you speak uses a lot of metaphors that think about time as vertical, you would also be faster. So in other words, she predicted that Mandarin speakers, when seeing the vertical, would be faster because it would prime a lot of vertical concepts, and English speakers would be faster to confirm when seeing horizontal primes because they think about time more horizontally.
And all these like were in their own language, right?
This would be in your own language, yes. And the reverse would be true. If you're an English speaker and you're primed with vertical, you'd be a little bit slower. So being faster in one just means being slower. And that's essentially what she found in her first results. After vertically oriented prime, Mandarin speakers faster to confirm temporal propositions than if they were shown a horizontal prime, and the reverse pattern was found for English speakers. So there was a reliable difference between the Mandarin speakers and the English speakers, depending on this priming effect. So that language differences predict aspects of temporal reasoning by speakers. She did find that it was flexible enough that if you remind speakers that there are alternative perspectives, English speakers might be thinking about time more vertically, because even in English, there are lots of vertical metaphors for time, things happening at the top of the hour, things happening at the top of the month or at the top of the day. You can sort of think about time in a lot of vertical ways. That difference can be reversed. So it's flexible enough that you can not only show these effects in primary language, but you can also change them by reminding people of alternative metaphors. So this would largely be evidence against a strong linguistic determinism hypothesis. It doesn't completely determine how you see the world, but it influences how you might perceive things on a day-to-day basis. Does that seem straightforward? Okay, I think that was my final example. So this is something you can read later, but there are no questions. And the only point that I was trying to make here, there's a link to something I wrote a number of years ago talking about how you can use textual analysis to maybe determine whether or not someone might be suffering from cognitive decline or Alzheimer's. This was done through written output with certain authors who were then later determined to have Alzheimer's disease. I want to go through this, and then I want to talk about the exam itself. So is everybody okay with that? Oh, it's great content, but I just don't want to take the time. I want to make sure you have time to talk about the exam before we go. Okay, so quiz and exam you know today. Oh, I forgot to update this. It's 12:30 to 12:30 a.m. So today, it's already been, I think I've reminded everybody at least twice on the Brightspace page, but quiz is available in just about half an hour. I'll get back to my office, make sure it's not timed, and it should be there the entire time. So once you've done that, start thinking about the midterm. Midterm is going to be a mix. It's going to be given here in this classroom. So what kind of questions might you see? You might see questions like this. First of all, by the way, there are no bubble sheets. This is all on one sheet. So you're going to get an exam book. You're going to write written things right on the exam book, and you're going to circle correct answers on the exam book. We're just going to do these by hand, mostly because half of it's already written, trying to coordinate some scanned and some not scanned. Have you ever been in that situation where your scan sheet disappears because it was placed in the wrong folder? We're just going to have everything all together. I think it's a little bit more straightforward. So you might have a question like, what is a major criticism of the dual process theory as outlined in the text? A, does not account for emotional influences. Is that a criticism or not? B, it overemphasizes the role of consciousness. It offers multiple and vague definitions for system 1 and system 2 behaviors, completely ignores the role of neural structures. Which of those 4 seems like the best answer?
See?
How many of you would say C? I think C seems like a reasonable answer. So that is, turns out that's the right answer. Another kind of multiple choice question is just essentially asking you to pick the term that fills in the blank. The term blank refers to the phenomenon of using technology to take on. Well, technology-assisted learning actually sounds reasonable, but that's not the term that we used, right? The term that we used was cognitive offloading. All of these, well, artificial intelligence isn't wrong in the sense that it also does that, but it's not the right answer. That's why I used this example here, because sometimes a multiple choice question has like a couple of possible answers that are right, but there's always one that's the rightest answer. That's what I want you to pick on the multiple choice question. Pick the answer that seems the most right, even though others might seem okay. When viewed in context, pick the answer that's the rightest. Here's how some of the short answers will be presented on the midterm. You'll see a question that sometimes has a blank, sometimes not, but there's always a little box below it and a number. This number tells you how many points. So a 1-point question is usually a 1-sentence or 1-word answer. Thinking or executing a behavior based on ease with which a similar example comes to mind is known as the availability heuristic, and that's what should go in there. And so when it's being scored, if you wrote availability or availability heuristic, you will get 1 full point. If you write something else, it's kind of hard to give partial credit in this case because it's sort of a right or wrong answer. So write them in the box. Here is an example of a 4-point question of the type that might show up on the midterm. In our first class, we discussed some research on how smartphones might interfere with cognitive processing. The first experiment suggested that the mere presence of a smartphone could interfere with cognition, and the second experiment suggested the result might not be replicable. For this question, please answer the following. What were the independent variables? So what were the independent variables then? In other words, what was manipulated?
If we either had the phone away, pocket, or on the multitask.
So you put your phone away, put it in your pocket, or you left it out on the desk. How was smartphone presence manipulated? It's kind of the same question, isn't it? In this case, you might say you could also answer between the 2 different experiments. In one case, it was manipulated by asking people to put it where it was should otherwise be. It could be placed face down, I think, in one of those cases. We told them, I think, to turn them off or to turn off. No, yes.
Like, could we just add like that some of it was higher salience than the other?
Yeah, I would add to this, and I would say that here were the conditions, and here's how it was manipulated. How was presence manipulated? Being in your pocket, for example, might be where you normally keep it.
Do you also say that for the first one, could you say that it was the location of the phone, and then the second one you out the different?
Exactly. Yeah. So the first one is asking specifically about the conditions. How was it manipulated? What were the variables? And the second one is asking more detail about how those variables were implemented in the experimental design. What were the key dependent variables? So that was where we asked, I think, depending on the experiment, I think one of them was asking about an O-span task, which is a working memory task, and the other was asking about a fluid intelligence task, Rabin's progressive matrices. And then ask you to compare group performances between the first study and the second study. So we talked about the study where it replicates, with the study where it failed to replicate. So we have one study, and then we have a second study, what replicated and what didn't. So it's going to take a few minutes. And what I would look for in cases like this would be things about describing the conditions, answering things about random assignment, asking things about the dependent variables, answering things about proximity and how it was changed. So there are lots of ways to answer this question. And when I'm scoring it, I'm looking to make sure that you answered specific aspects of that question. So there aren't too many questions like this on the exam, but they usually have multiple parts, and they're asking you to express sort of in your own words, and these can be sentences, sometimes bullet points. And I'm not looking for any one particular surface structure. I'm looking to know that you understand the deep structure about that particular experiment or that particular exam. Okay, so does that seem straightforward to everybody? Most of it's short answer, multiple choice, and there are a few of these longer ones. There's a couple of other things which should help. It lines up really well with the study guide. And each section of questions is set off with a heading. So all of the questions that are kind of on the first topic, they're going to be section 1 of the exam. Everything on similarity is going to be in section 2, similarity. So I'll put all the similarity questions together, all the memory questions together, all of the concept questions together, which should help in terms of your ability to answer these. Okay, if you do have questions, of course, there's no class between now and the midterm, but if there are questions specifically, this is still a good way to let me know. I can answer them by email. I do have office hours today, and if you can't make it and you still have questions, feel free to email.
Yeah.
Good luck next week. I'll see you back here.
Thanks again.
Online, I'll go. Like, it's not actually if you like understand the study.